Hello, everyone. Good to see you again. My name is Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes. I'm a philosopher here at Exeter, for those of you who don't know. I will be co-presenting this talk with Rennie Joseph here. I'll just introduce us first, then I'm going to talk about what we'll be doing, and it will be basically two presentations, mine first and then Rennie's after. And they are interlinked, but obviously we'll be talking about our own fields. So what I think is especially nice about this really is that this is a project that fuses two departments, philosophy or SPA and psychology. And partly, well, mostly really inspired by this very colloquium. We had Chris Timmermann come here a few months ago, talk about his metaphysical shift study. This sort of spurred us on, as it were. Okay, so first of all, I'll just introduce Rennie, who'll be speaking after me. Rennie Joseph then is a postdoc here at Exeter. He got his PhD in cognitive neuroscience at Cambridge, that's right, isn't it? And he's got a bachelor's degree in psychology. He's generally sort of interested in philosophy as well, I think it's fair to say, isn't it? So a broad interest. I'm, well, you know me, a philosopher of mind here at Exeter. Okay, so we've got 64 slides. I'm gonna have to do each slide quite fast, right? So, but I'm happy to take questions, especially afterwards, of course. Also, this is a work in progress. So, and also this was put together quite last minute. So it's far from perfect. So please excuse any discrepancies, any faults. Okay, so what's this project we're working on? Okay, this is how it started then. So psychedelic experiences are popularly believed to be able to induce metaphysical experiences. I shall explain what I mean by that term in a moment, and to produce lasting changes in metaphysical beliefs. Metaphysical beliefs are arguably important for societal cohesion and psychological welfare. Psychedelics seem to be able to shift metaphysical beliefs and thus may have social and psychological value. This then is based on the Timmermann paper, but also there was a paper from Griffiths and Nayak, I think, on this recently as well, a few weeks ago. We intend to better identify and differentiate these psychedelic-induced metaphysical shifts. So one issue, I think, with the Timmermann paper was that, you know, as we saw in the Q&A, there was sort of I don't think the metaphysical views were very clearly differentiated. This is a very tricky thing to do, however, but this is what we have attempted. This has resulted in an Exeter metaphysics questionnaire based upon a new metaphysics matrix. By matrix here has meant the fact that a lot of these metaphysical views coincide, they weave into one another, they overlap, as we shall see. So that's kind of been my role in this project, really trying to identify and differentiate different types of metaphysical viewpoints. The results from that questionnaire, as Rennie will talk about then, will be modeled via factor analysis and cutting-edge methods involving natural language processing and machine learning. This is obviously Rennie's field, with two main aims. Firstly, to establish a refined set of survey items that best represent a range of metaphysical positions. So in theory, this result itself can be used elsewhere as well. In other words, there will be a new metaphysical questionnaire survey to be used. Secondly, though, specifically to this project, we'll aim to establish whether the metaphysical beliefs held by individuals are predictive of their language use and open text responses. This is something that Rennie will explain in more detail. So this is the plan today. I forgot to put my alarm on, right. Anyway, so two parts. First part on metaphysics. What is metaphysics? What are metaphysical positions, and how does that relate to psychedelic experience? That'll be my part. And then Rennie will talk about the modeling. So that'll be inspiration, the previous studies, Timmermann. Exeter metaphysics questionnaire. You'll see the questions within that questionnaire. As I say, it's a work in progress, so it still needs to be refined more further. And then an analysis plan, self-organizing maps and natural language processing, Rennie stuff. Okay, so let's begin with metaphysics. So where's the term come from? Well, originally the term metaphysics comes from Aristotle's book Metaphysics, right? Which was just really a collection of texts by Aristotle that a later editor put in a collection after the physics, meta meaning after in this sense. So that's where the word came from. Aristotle called it first philosophy rather than metaphysics, but it's the word then has come to denote what Aristotle speaks about in that mess of a book. It's a real mess. It's a mess because it contradicts itself. And so you think Aristotle wrote these segments in different eras, maybe at different times of his life, or maybe Aristotle didn't even pen all of them. It's a bit of a strange book. Anyway, what kind of questions do you find within that book, and what really defines metaphysics? Well, importantly, there's ontology, which is the study of ontos, being, and that generally ramifies down to substance. What is that which stands, holds up reality, including processes? And then you get the classic ontological distinctions, which I'll go through in a bit more detail in a moment. So is it just the physical? Of course, Aristotle there was referring to physicalist philosophers in ancient Greece, like Democritus, Leucippus. In fact, Democritus was the first properly psychedelic philosopher in that he created a taxonomy of psychoactive plants and was said to drift into the boundedlessness. Only fragments. So anyway, so the physical could be a substance, the mental could be a substance. The physical and mental could both be substances. That's dualism. I'll explain this in a bit more detail in a moment. There's the immanent neutral, so the ultimate substance is neither physical nor mental, but it's part of this reality nonetheless. Or it could be the transcendent, so something that exists outside of physicality, outside of mentality even. This was, Aristotle's teacher Plato, of course, pushed for this in his theory of forms. And so you get really two kinds of dualism there. You get dualism mental and physical, but you can also get dualism with the actual world and the transcendental world, as it were. And then, but also in that book, Metaphysics, you get questions not really relating to ontology, like questions about what causation is, what form is, what qualities really are, properties, relations, modal properties, necessity, possibility, potentiality, and so on. And, they teach metaphysics. I've taught it here in Exeter, and that's really analytic metaphysics. It's got very, very little to do with mysticism or psychedelics. It's like pretty hard-nosed logical relations between properties and whatnot. Anyway, we are interested in one aspect of metaphysics, which are the ontologies, in relation to how these might be perceived through certain psychedelic experiences. So we've tried to, and this is the problem with all of these views are they all kind of intersect. Every particular philosopher has got his own little, or her own little kind of nuanced position and so on. So it's very hard to actually differentiate these things, but we tried. One thing you'll notice there, we've got, I don't know if you remember, but in the Timmermann paper, he said that there was a shift from generally physicalism to panpsychism. But one problem with that is, was that a dog? Yeah, there you go. The problem with that, of course, is that some people define panpsychism as physicalism, such as Galen Strawson and Karl Popper. So that's why we've sort of tried to differentiate it in this respect. Also, panpsychism was kind of defined in a way that you could define idealism. So we've tried to basically break these down into further categories. All of these, most of these, all of these categories really are related to something in philosophy of mind called the hard problem of consciousness, which is how the physical and the mental relate to one another. I haven't got time to talk about what I mean by the physical or the mental. That's a talk in itself. But essentially, the hard problem comes down to this. This is it's coined by an Australian philosopher called David Chalmers in 1995, but this is from his book a year after. He writes this: the hard problem. Why is all this physiological processing accompanied by an experienced inner life? In other words, why is it that there is a correlation between physical things going on in the body and phenomenological experience? Why is experience even necessary? Why is the mental even necessary? And he writes this interestingly, I think: a solution to this problem may profoundly affect our conception of the universe and of ourselves. In other words, this problem, which is a problem for philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, whatever, the solution to it will probably have very significant metaphysical consequences. It's nothing new. David Chalmers coined that program, what we see in 1689 with John Locke, for example. Quote, we can by no means conceive how any size, figure, or motion of any particles can possibly produce in us the idea of any color, taste, or sound whatsoever. There is no conceivable connection between the one and the other. In other words, no matter the complexity of the brain, no matter how good the correlates become, if they do become established, the hard problem still presents itself. Jae-Gwon Kim, who's a really great philosopher of mind, died a couple of years ago. He wrote this, which I think is pertinent to a lot of psychedelic research at the moment. A very simple point, really. He writes, making a running list of psychoneural correlation does not come anywhere near gaining an explanatory insight into why there are such correlations. So we will not, in other words, fully understand experience, let alone psychedelic experience, by simply mapping the correlates in the brain. I say this, you think, oh, it's okay, a lot of people accept that. But when I was reading, for example, this paper by Robin Carr, Harris, David Rizzo, Rosalind Watts, and others from 4 years ago about nature connectedness, very interesting paper about clinical results, but suddenly there's this paragraph in the middle of it, which is seemingly ideological. They write this, we recognize that the healthy demystification process that is presently taking place in psychedelic research relies in no small part on the identification of biological substrates, in other words, neural correlates of high-level subjective experiences, consciousness. And we have no doubt that both an acute and enduring sense of connectedness have identifiable biological substrates. Our work on the neural correlates of ego dissolution may be considered part of a progressive initiative to demystify the psychedelic experience. So there's one interesting approach to psychedelic research now, which is as soon as we've got all the correlates, then we demystify it. We demystify the process and we can reduce it to the sort of the mindset that we have, which is sort of default mindset, it seems, in many of the special sciences in the West. But of course, as Kim says, this won't do. You know, this is not sufficient. You do not get sufficient explanation by providing those correlates. Of course, they might be useful in other regards. They could, you could still show, for example, health benefits understanding these correlates, but you don't get a sufficient explanation. Which is important, of course, when we consider metaphysics, because it means that certain experiences, not all, certain experiences that you can have in psychedelics, which change metaphysical beliefs, can't be simply falsified by finding neural correlates. You know, in my view, one should stay agnostic as to this, the metaphysical significance of this. Just to go through some of these metaphysical views in a little bit more detail. So there's dualism, which is the view that mind and matter are separate from Plato, but especially from Descartes. We get reductive physicalism, that there is no consciousness, no mind at all, essentially. We get what's mostly common today, non-reductive physicalism or emergentism, which is the view that the brain conditions is the necessary and sufficient condition for consciousness. At the same time, you see a little down arrow, which is the belief that there's also mental causation. In other words, that consciousness can have an effect upon how you behave and the world around you. In other words, for example, our human intelligence can have an effect upon the world. Most people wouldn't deny that. They say, of course, it's the case, but it's actually very hard to fit this into a metaphysical picture, because it sort of says that there must exist certain types of force that are not known through physics. So that's why a lot of people who do physics don't like the mental causation. However, from the other side, if you deny it, it seems anti-evolutionary. Like, why would consciousness or sentience evolve, not just in humans, but in presumably many different species, if consciousness had no power upon reality in your body whatsoever? So this is just another aspect of the hard problem of consciousness. More radically, you get idealism, for example, from Berkeley, or Kant, or Schopenhauer. So that's the view that physical reality we see is a construct. So the fundamental substance is mind rather than matter. Panpsychism, which was mentioned in the Timmermann paper, and what I happen to do my PhD on, is the view that this distinction between mind and matter really is false. They're both abstractions. What is the essential core substance of reality is both mind and matter. So everything has an element of mind, not consciousness, not complex consciousness, but basic drives, perhaps, something akin to our subconscious. This is panpsychisms generally, but not always, but in the modern forms of panpsychism is generally identified as a monism, but it can also be a physicalism or a dualism and so on. And then, in other words, to this neutral monism, this is the view that neither mind nor matter are the fundamental substance of reality. They're both, as it were, are expressions or both emerge from a neutral substance, something other than them or something more than them. So those are just a few of the ontologies. I mean, I find generally speaking, a lot of people think there are only two. That's either physical, everything's the brain, or there's dualism. Otherwise, you believe in Jesus Christ, you're going to devote yourself to the church, right? So this is a false dichotomy, I think. You know, there are many, many options. These are not even exhaustive here. Even physicalisms ramify into different types. So you got eliminativism, there's no consciousness, that gets rid of the hard problem of consciousness, there's no consciousness. There's epiphenomenalism, which means that the mind is like an after effect of the brain, but has no power. There's emergentism, as I mentioned, that does allow for mental power, but also allows for different properties in the mental. And then you get the circoneural identity theory, which is common in the mid-20th century, which is the view that the mind and the brain are identical, but only the brain. So the mind's not identical to other forms of matter. This was very common until there was a paper really in the early 60s, which pointed out paradoxes in that view. My own personal preference is a type of neutral monism, especially that initiated by Spinoza. He thought there's one substance, that's why it's a monism. He called that both God and nature, that's why he got into trouble with the powers that be. This is pantheism, basically, when you think nature is God. This is an interesting, I point this out because not only, in my view, is this the most parsimonious viewpoint, you know, plus Darwin, which equals Whitehead, but in the Timmermann paper, there was no mention of pantheism, really. But this seems to be a very common, at least in the West, maybe elsewhere, a very common outcome of psychedelic experiences, which is linked to panpsychism, especially in Spinoza. Panpsychism says one substance and thought is one expression of that substance, one attribute. Extensional space is another, or the physicality is another expression of the same thing. They are essentially then different, mind and matter are different expressions of one substance, which is God or nature. So there you see, if all of matter has a mental aspect, that's the panpsychism, but they're both expressions of this one monist substance. So that's a pantheism. Thus, you see how they're interrelated. I mean, this is nothing new. Albert Hofmann invented LSD in his book, LSD, My Problem Child, from '79. In his final chapter, the epigraph of that is a quotation from Goethe, where he writes, "What more can a person gain in life than that God nature reveals himself to him?" That's Goethe referring to Spinoza, of course. And then Hofmann speaks about this monism. We also get it in Benny Shannon, this famous book now, Antipodes of the Mind, charting the phenomenology of the ayahuasca experience. I mean, he claims there, this is, I'm sure like a lot of people would disagree with this, but he claims that, quote, overall, ayahuasca induces a comprehensive metaphysical view of things. I would characterize it as an idealistic monism with pantheistic overtones. Reality is conceived as constituted by one non-material substance, which is identified as cosmic consciousness. Spinoza would accept them. That's interesting when you think about perennialism and contextualism, which we can talk about later. Also, Walter Stace, who was so influential with regard to clinical trials and psychedelics today, writes this in his book, Mysticism and Philosophy from 1960. He writes, quote, "Pantheism is forced upon us by mysticism, together with a proper understanding of the meaning of the notion of the infinite, the eternal, timeless." That book, by the way, has a kind of 8-point list of criteria for mysticism, which created really, or was the main inspiration for the Hood mysticism scale from 1975, which is very often used in clinical trials today. I'm just going to quickly then relate that metaphysics to psychedelic experience, and then Rennie can take over. I'll just point out, first of all, as well, that you have to be careful not to equate all these terms. So where shall I start? You know, metaphysics can include mystical insights, for example, timelessness, spacelessness, but it needn't. You know, when I'm for example, when I'm teaching analytic metaphysics and we talk about the nature of identity or the identity of a person through time, it's got very little to do with mysticism, very little to do with psychedelic experience as well. Mysticism doesn't have to, of course, mostly is not induced by psychedelic experience, at least in the history. It needn't be related to metaphysics. For example, you can get biblical types of mysticism, which don't seem to be related to anything in philosophical metaphysics. And then you get psychedelic experiences that are neither metaphysical nor mystical, you know? So like, for example, when you take LSD to become a better fighter, or when you take ayahuasca to locate lost objects, or just laughing, or something like this, or seeing amazing colors. I mean, one definition, mysticism is very, I mean, all of these terms are very ambiguous, really. So like people even argue about what mysticism is. Walter Stace, for example, says it excludes really the visual completely. So, you know, therefore, like kaleidoscopic psychedelic experience wouldn't be classified as mysticism, let alone metaphysics. But they do all coincide. So generally speaking then, some issues that crop up from thinking about psychedelic experience in relation to metaphysics and in relation to clinical trials, mental health. Can there be metaphysical neutrality in psychedelic practice? There's been a lot of recent papers about saying, you know, we shouldn't try to frame these experiences in any metaphysical framework at all. But is there a neutrality? I mean, physicalism itself is a metaphysical viewpoint, right? So are you not then, I mean, this is something for debate. The comforting delusion objection. So this is from, was coined by Michael Pollan, who I'm sure you've heard of. Chris Leatherby wrote a book about it recently that I reviewed. It's the notion that, you know, most of these psychedelic experiences induce delusions. All these metaphysical monist views are delusions. Isn't it therefore unethical to treat people for their mental health by inducing a comforting delusion? But that depends on two things, really. Are they delusions? How do you determine delusions? And that's determined by metaphysics, because you can't say what's a delusion until you say what reality is. And every single metaphysical option has got problems. And secondly, it relies on a certain normative ethical approach, which is hard to substantiate within the from the perspective which makes the objection. Another interesting thing that we've spoken about, I know in this colloquium for many times, perennialism and contextualism. Is it the case that these metaphysical experiences or mystical experiences are perennial, in other words, the same amongst all peoples and all cultures, or does the culture actually condition the experience, and if so, to what extent? 100% down to zero. If you read Stephen Katz who basically initiated contextualism, he, over the years, sort of reached the midway point. An interesting question, but one I find particularly important or interesting is this question: what might metaphysical learning help integrate psychedelic metaphysical experiences for longer term benefits? In other words, let's say you have this profound metaphysical or mystical or both experience. You come out of it. Now, how do you respond to that? You can either say, well, that was interesting, but complete delusion, determining it on your culture's standards of reality, or could it be that by giving people a sort of greater learning and metaphysical possibilities, that would help them integrate what they experienced? It's a question, I don't know the answer. Why do psychedelics seemingly alter metaphysical beliefs? This is, we can do trials to say that they do, but the question still is why? Is there a metaphysical explanation for that? And what societal global ramifications may arise from greater psychedelic use? I mean, we're doing these clinical trials here now, but if they become decriminalized or legalized, how might that change society? I mean, this is a greater question, of course, but it was a question coined at the very start of the word psychedelic. So the word psychedelic was coined in 1956, 57. It was coined by Humphrey Osmond, who was a psychiatrist. He first of all wrote the word to Aldous Huxley in private letters, but then in this 1957 paper, he made it public, as it were. Anyway, in that very paper, he talks about William James and Bergson, and he includes nitrous oxide as a psychedelic, as a side note. But he writes this: perhaps most important, and he was a psychiatrist, not a philosopher, there are social, philosophical, and religious implications in the discoveries made by means of these agents. And I think this is something that we haven't fully analysed at all, partly because 10 years after the statement was made, they became illegal. Anyway, that's my part. And now I'm going to hand it over to Rennie, who will talk about the analysis of those metaphysical positions.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you all for coming. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the data handling and analysis side of the project. But I just want to give a heads up to Timmermann et al., who in part formed the inspiration for this project and were speaking at the colloquium previously. So they wrote a paper entitled Psychedelics Alter Metaphysical Beliefs, in which they recruited a large sample of participants ahead of a ceremonial retreat wherein the participants took a psychedelic compound. They collected survey data before the experience and after the experience 4 weeks and 6 months later, and asked them about their beliefs, their mental health, and their prior drug usage. Importantly, they then compared these findings, or replicated them, should I say, in a randomized clinical trial looking to treat major depressive disorder with psilocybin versus SSRIs, and also measured the beliefs before and afterwards. So they attempted to create their own questionnaire, which is a metaphysical beliefs questionnaire. And they tried to formulate the items in a way not satisfactory to Peter, but that represent the classical metaphysical positions in lay language. They did a factor analysis, and they found a one-factor solution with 9 items loading onto it. The items that loaded positively related to supernatural realms of existence, supernatural unifying principles of reality, panpsychism, dualism, and idealism. The items that loaded negatively were the hard materialistic or physicalistic positions, or just more generally belief in naturalistic explanations for phenomena we observe in the universe. And yeah, so they basically measured the factor scores on this non-physical beliefs factor before the retreat for a baseline, 4 weeks after and 6 months following the retreat. And they found, as Peter mentioned, a shift away from the hard materialist positions and towards non-physicalist beliefs. So the effects were enduring. The effects were particularly strong during after using it for the first time, and they steadily plateaued with further use. And importantly, these findings were replicated in the randomized trial. So people who took psilocybin tended to have a shift towards non-physical beliefs, and this was related positively to their well-being. So this sort of implies that a shift in metaphysical beliefs is a potential mechanism for therapeutic effect of the psychedelics, or the psychedelic experience, should I say. And so that was sort of one of the driving factors behind the project. So we kind of realized that, well, if we weren't satisfied with Timmermann's questionnaire, then were there any others out there? So we did a literature review and basically found that there's questionnaires out there, but they all kind of look at their own specific things in spirituality or religion or metaphysics, but none of them are quite as comprehensive as we might like. So we created our own questionnaire to try and plug the perceived gaps according to Peter's matrix. So what we do is we have our questionnaire and we have all the other questionnaires, and we sort of just throw them all together. We want to try and find the items that most effectively capture a variety of beliefs. So we also speculatively include an open text response question to see if we can then link those beliefs to language usage. So as Peter already mentioned, the project has 2 aims. First, develop a more comprehensive and refined questionnaire for use by researchers and clinicians. Second, determine whether different beliefs map onto different linguistic styles. So here's just a list of some of the questionnaires that we drew from. We've got Timmermann's questionnaire, metaphysical beliefs questionnaire, We've got a mind-body relations questionnaire. We've got a free will and determinism scale. We've got a spiritual beliefs and values scale. And we've got a mysticism scale. We omitted the MEQ, even though it's really popular, just because it tends to be phrased in a way that's like more relevant to acute experiences after people have just directly taken the drug, rather than just their general experience. So I'll skip over this because Peter already kind of mentioned it. But I'll just re-emphasize that essentially in the processes of us trying to come up with this, well, I say us, Peter, and then I'm trying to teach it. We sort of realized that it's super hard to come up with well-defined categories or questions to tap the specific positions. And this is for two reasons. First, even for seasoned philosophers such as Peter, these positions are heavily overlapping and not mutually exclusive. And secondly, language is subjective and often ambiguous. But nonetheless, we went ahead and created what we're calling the Exeter Metaphysics questionnaire, which currently has 36 items. And they're sort of just presented and then you answer on a Likert scale, whether you agree or disagree. So there's these general categories, the first being physicalism. So things related to like everything's made of matter, consciousness is an emergent property of the brain, and so on. We've got idealism, so the consciousness first perspectives. Dualism, the idea that everything has a spiritual component and a physical component. Monism, the idea that the physical and mental are derived from something even more fundamental. We also, I should mention, we have sort of the panpsychist ones under that bracket. We've got the transcendent, because we sort of wanted to account for these entities that people are reporting, and things like ghosts, angels, so on, and then other realms, dimensions of space. We also have a theism category, so whether like you believe in God and the nature of God, good and evil. And so the idea is that we'll get all of these. I think there's 137 total R's plus everything else. And we throw it into a big exploratory factor analysis, which is a really popular statistical technique in the psychological and sociological sciences. But for those of you who aren't so familiar with it, essentially it's a statistical technique by which we derive a relatively orthogonal set of latent variables in a way that's parsimonious, most parsimonious to the covariant structure that exists. So essentially, how does each item relate to each other item? And then are there collections of items that relate to one another in sort of consistent ways? So in this sense, each latent factor could be thought of as a constellation of beliefs. And I use this term a little bit. So what I mean by constellation of beliefs is sort of just a set of beliefs. And so after we've done this, we can use the factor loadings in common sense to reduce the items into a more comprehensive questionnaire. So we might imagine that, let's say one of the factors is physicalism, and we have two items, and one question sort of says everything's made of material, and another says everything's made of atoms. We would expect that these two items were heavily correlated and would be associated with the same factor. But if they're so heavily correlated, then one of them kind of might become redundant, so we can just get rid of it and replace that just with a single one. On the other side, there might be items that don't really explain any variance, and therefore they're not really giving us anything. They might be interesting to muse upon, but they're not really giving anything from a statistical point of view. So let's imagine we have a population of people and they all hold different beliefs, and we want to try and split them up according to their beliefs. So what we want to do is we want to use data-driven machine learning algorithms to form clusters of people with similar belief constellations. And the positive of using this approach is that it removes any biases about which beliefs we assume belong together based on our human understanding, and instead lets the data speak for itself. This could reaffirm our human models, or it might reject them. One such technique is called self-organizing maps. This is a type of artificial neural network. It's an unsupervised machine learning algorithm, and it uses the geometric topography of the data to determine the model parameters. It does this by mapping the raw data iteratively onto the model and updating the parameters accordingly on each iteration. I really like this method because I find it very intuitive. I think it's a very realistic representation of the data, and it can capture non-linearities, unlike the factor analyses just mentioned or other general linear models. So for these reasons, I think it's a great method for data reduction and visualization. So a little bit more about how it works. So essentially, this black grid of nodes that you can see here is the model, and the red dots that you can see is the data. And on each iteration, each of the data points gets assigned to one of the nodes. And then in an updating phase, the node updates itself such that it moves closer to the geometric location of all the data points that got assigned to it. And over time, over several steps, so the model learns the topography, the geometric topography of the data. So to give a more concrete example, as you probably know, color can be represented in red, green, and blue triplets. So what I did is I drew 3,000 random values of red, green, and blue, which you can see here, whacked them into a big 3D matrix, 60 by 50 by 3. And so to relate it to our project, each color would be analogous to a set of beliefs. And so, imagine this as a population's beliefs, and it's all jumbled up, as you can see here with the colors. So what we do is we create a reduced model version of this randomly, 10 by 10 by 3. And what we can see the algorithm does is it sort of sorts all of these data points out into groups. So colors that are more similar to one another wind up next to one another in this 2D space. But really this 2D space, have nested dimensions with the same dimensionality as the data. And so these nested dimensions would be equivalent to the items in our questionnaire. So the red, green, and blue values in this case, but in our case, the specific questions. And you can, so this is really useful just to get a quick overview, because you can sort of see, so here yellow corresponds to a high value, and blue, I think that is, corresponds to a lower value. So we can sort of see the red colors are high in red, the green colors are high in green, so on and so forth, and the colors that are a mixture are a mixture, as would be the case with beliefs. So what we can do then is we can then apply another machine learning algorithm called k-means clustering. So here it's just an arbitrary two-dimensional example with 3 clusters, but this method extends to n-dimensional space and k number of clusters. And what the algorithm seeks to do is it finds k vectors or centroids in the n-dimensional space, and it maximizes the homogeneity within the clusters whilst also maximizing the heterogeneity between the clusters. So here we can sort of see we've got 3 clusters of data just from looking at it, and the algorithm finds, and we've specified 3 as the number, so the algorithm finds 3 points in the space that best represent these groups, and then each data point gets assigned to the point in the space that's closest to them. And so this is good because it allows us to find a specified number of belief constellations. So we've sorted the population into groups of beliefs, and now we're interested in asking whether these belief clusters might influence the way people use language. Why are we interested in this? Well, I think narratives are a really important aspect of the human experience. We use them all the time, across cultures, across time. They're a window into the subjective. So I think if we want to bridge the objective to the subjective, this is one way to start going about it. And I think for these reasons, it could provide further insights into the hows and whys people hold certain beliefs. and how these beliefs relate to well-being or other aspects of cognition. I think if we develop models, they could also prove to be a useful and flexible tool when using questionnaires isn't really desirable or not possible for whatever reason. So to do this, we want to use natural language processing. And natural language processing spans several fields, including psychology, linguistics, computer science, and artificial intelligence. It's about the interaction between computers and human languages. It involves mathematical modeling of various aspects of language, with the aim to abstract human language into more general categories and rules so that we can do science with it and do quantitative stuff. Some common applications include automated translators, text processors, speech recognition, artificial intelligence, and classification problems. We can use written language or spoken language. There's loads of different types of natural language processing and loads of different analysis pipelines that we might use. Each comes with its own nuances, but it can be roughly divided into two broad domains. Semantic analyses, so these are concerned with inferring the contextual meaning of the content. And non-semantic analyses, so these are looking at the relative frequencies of different aspects of the speech. So how we're going about to collect our data for this in this study. This is how we're currently going about it. And if you have any ideas, please do let us know, because this is just my random first idea. I have no idea whether it makes any sense. So we asked the participants, we are interested in hearing about how you've been thinking and feeling about life recently. What has brought you meaning? What do you find beautiful about life? How do you relate to others? How do you relate to your surroundings? What inspires you? What are some interesting thoughts you've had? These are just some ideas to guide you, but feel free to express yourself as you wish. We would be grateful if you could write a paragraph or two reflecting upon your recent life experiences. So, for example, someone might say, I've been feeling very positive about life recently and found meaning in the little everyday things, such as interactions with my co-workers, noticing the birds in the sky, or appreciating the color of the leaves. My family has always been very important for me, and they provide me with meaning and the motivation I need to keep going. So the idea here is that we might get them to talk about something or write a little bit of stuff that could relate to metaphysics but implicitly, without explicitly pigeonholing them somewhere or getting them to state, I believe in blah, blah, blah. So what do we do with this? So essentially we'll have hopefully we'll have a couple of paragraphs of this nature from every participant. And we need to do some pre-processing, so to put it into a suitable form for analysis. So first we convert them all to lowercase, remove any unwanted punctuation, special characters, white space, etc. And then we break down the streams of textual data into words, terms, sentences, symbols, or some other meaningful element. And we refer to these elements as tokens. We've chosen words here for simplicity and interpretability, but a more complex breakdown further down the line might reveal additional layers. So we end up with a list of word frequencies and words for each individual. Now we could just do the analysis on word frequencies alone, but we can sort of go one step further and process it one more step using a program called LIWIC, which stands for Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, which is a program developed by psychologists and linguists that takes in-text and breaks it down into different word categories that reflect different emotions, thinking styles, social concerns, and various other aspects of speech. It does this using predefined word dictionaries and sub-dictionaries. There's 76 LIWIC categories off the bat, but this is kind of just and we'll get a score for each of them, but it's just a bit too much to take in, or that some of them relate to one another. So we're going to use another statistical trick known as principal component analysis to reduce the number of categories to the most statistically meaningful ones. So here are an example of some of the categories. I won't go through all of them because there's loads, but we've got stuff like pronouns, other aspects of grammar, biological processes, perception, personal concerns, drives, time orientation, emotions, social concerns, cognitive processes, and then some language style things. So this could be rephrased by asking, do people with certain belief constellations use words belonging to certain categories at different frequencies in response to the open text question? To answer this, we can use typical between group comparisons such as ANOVAs or t-tests, but we might be able to do better and use the supervised machine learning techniques to classify beliefs based on language style. So essentially using people's language style to try and predict their belief categories. So these algorithms are given the belief categories or the labels, and from guessing many times, that's how they determine the model parameters. Some potential algorithms that we could use include logistic regression, artificial neural networks, support vector machines, naive Bayes classifiers, or decision trees. And essentially the essential idea with most of these more or less is we give the algorithm or the model a stream of text, and it assigns a probability to each of the beliefs positions that we've decided, and it'll give an answer for the one it thinks is most likely. And then that way we can say how accurate is it at guessing someone's beliefs based on their language to sort of determine how well it's performing, or if it's telling us anything at all. It might just not work. I briefly wanted to mention a related project that I'm also working on, just to kind of tie this into the bigger picture. So it's not a standalone thing, which involves taking these trip reports. So when people take different substances, they go on the internet and write what their experience was like. So we use these websites, Reddit, Blue Light, and Psychonaut Wiki to get a bunch of trip reports and some very preliminary data just to kind of show you the sort of thing we're doing. So I was using the maps that I explained to you earlier, and using that we had these 15 different word categories. And so as we can see here, we've got LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, and ketamine. And so each of these drugs sort of has their word category personality, if you like. And it might tell us something comparing these and provide us with some insights, but I've not really done any more on this to say anything more. So ultimately what we might do is we might ask what people's beliefs and language are before the experience, during or retrospectively in the experience, and then after the experience. I'm aware that this makes the metaphysical assumption that time is linear, so I have to be careful. And in pictorial form, it might look like this. So we might have a sad businessman that's going about his day, you know, wants 9 to 5, earn money. He goes on an ayahuasca ceremony, realizes that he's the universe and realizes his own divinity and that it's a waste of time. And then walks around wearing these sorts of things. So to recap, metaphysical belief transformations provide a promising avenue through which psychedelics might have a therapeutic effect towards better mental health or addiction outcomes. The field is lacking a comprehensive set of tools for assessing and understanding people's beliefs. So the current study endeavours to improve this by developing a more comprehensive set of survey items and linking them to certain aspects of language using natural language processing and machine learning methods. It's relatively uncharted territory and there are many forking paths, so any comments, questions or suggestions are most welcome. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, questions then?
I don't know if we'll be able to.
Oh, right. Okay, well, I guess we'll post. Christine?
So, very practical question. Have you an actual questionnaire that in principle we could all fill out?
Yeah.
And then you could run it through your analysis. And then you could tell me what you believe, I believe.
Yeah.
And I could read that and can tell you whether it's any use. Wouldn't that be a first thing to do?
Yeah.
I can't recognize my beliefs in what you tell me what my beliefs are. What do we have then?
But it was you that answered them, so I mean.
Yeah, but within a matrix that was given to me. So if I find the outcome not recognizable, there might be something.
So when you ask the question, you don't see the matrix. You just answer the question.
Yeah, I know. But
Well,
these are the questions I have to answer, you know. I might have asked myself other questions or something. So if you do such a thing.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, it might be useful.
We can do that. We will give you the questionnaire of some of the slides, you know, but you know, whether you can model that, you know, is not useful, of course, one person, but it would be indicative, perhaps. Yeah, I mean, I don't. Do you want to do that? I mean, we could just test it out.
I don't see why not.
There's no harm in it.
Well, do it on like a smaller set of people.
Yeah.
Open the chat. There's a couple of people who said at the top.
Right, yeah.
There you go.
Okay. All right, thanks. Rennie.
I think this is a fascinating project, and I think Christine has a point that maybe it's worth, at least in the pilot phase, to check your interpretation with the people that actually put in the data. Does that represent how they feel, what they believe? I think could even be like a first part, if it's not possible to do that, obviously with all participants with large samples. But also I'm quite curious about the second part of the project, the open text data that you're planning to use. You said you're going to try to identify linguistic styles that tie together. Can I ask what you mean by linguistic styles? What are you going to ask the machine to learn to identify?
So in this case, very basic, just different word frequencies or the frequency at which they get assigned to dictionaries. But you could look at something like, I don't know,
So
sentence structure, or like.
You're looking at the same, people using the same words rather than style.
Yeah, I guess words are part of the style, but you could look at other aspects of the speech as well. But in this case, yeah, we're just starting very basic and going with the word usage.
Please.
So on your survey, is that like a Likert scale type thing where you can strongly agree or disagree? Is there I don't know, because like
That's an option, actually.
is it an option? I have a feeling like if I filled something like that out, there might be a lot of don't know, because it's like I don't know enough about universe to say whether one metaphysical position is correct.
Yeah. Well, you can answer as well, but I think, you know, if you have the mid option is I don't know, and there's also a separate question that you have no beliefs at all, right? So I think we cater for that, but
Yeah.
it's a work in progress. So that questionnaire is still being updated a little bit.
Yeah. I guess that would be interesting anyway if somebody went from not knowing to having very strong beliefs. There'd still be a shift, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it'd be interesting if someone didn't have beliefs. So is that even possible? I mean, maybe.
Yeah. You'd probably expect someone to have beliefs and then become more agnostic, like less certain of stuff.
I think I act like I have beliefs. If that makes sense. Like I act like I have free will, but I couldn't say for sure that I do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's actually a word for that. I can't remember what the word is now, but there is a new word for that. I think also, like, a lot of us have beliefs which we're not conscious of. And so questionnaires like this might sort of bring out, make explicit what you sort of assume have never really questioned, perhaps.
Maybe the problem with studying philosophy is that you actually question everything and therefore you're not really sure of anything. But maybe most of the people filling in your questionnaire will be more helpful than me. But sorry, may I just very quickly ask another question? So the one where you're analysing the text, I think that's really interesting. Is that just exploratory, or is there something you're hoping that this will be useful?
At this stage, exploratory.
Yeah.
And I guess exploratory, and then what I would really like to do is sort of link it with more qualitative research at so let's say we use this machine learning to sort of identify some general gists and themes, or like sort of what I would call like an archetypal report. Then what we could do is sort of get like the top 10 examples of that and get someone to go in and do a really in-depth qualitative analysis using other methods that I'm not really that familiar with, but I think that a lot more like meaningful to the subjective experience than just simply what category does a word belong to, for example. So
yeah, so it's like a start.
yeah. I think Jamie's got a question.
You have
online.
one question.
Oh, cool.
I don't know how we activate.
Can you hear me?
Oh, good. First of all, hi everyone. It's really weird being not in person today, but I had so many exams to mark that I didn't have time to actually come in. So I'm asking the question remotely. My question is about methodology, really, around the recruitment of people to the exploratory survey. So how are you going to go about recruiting the sample initially to not to factor analyze, but for this complex analysis that you're going to do? Because surely there's potential for the recruitment to be biased, and consequently this could impact the kind of themes that are brought forward when you create the survey. So particularly if you advertise online and then you get, say, people who were hardcore psychonauts and they respond to the survey versus people who've never done anything like this. Have you thought about how that could impact the type of finished product?
Yeah, for sure. So ideally, we'd want as wide an array of beliefs from as wide an array of different kinds of people as possible. But then there's practical issues of just actually getting the data. So we want to ideally, we'd have enough money to use a site called Prolific that's international, and you can sort of specify the criteria to be very broad, and you're not going to get the attention of anyone in particular. But so we might use that in part, but then we also might have to go down some routes of like advertising on social media to get some more data. So inevitably, I think it will be biased in some way. Can't really avoid that, but we're not going to go and post it on like Psychonaut forums or make it obvious that it's explicitly about psychedelics or anything. Like people won't even know this is about psychedelics. Yeah.
Yeah, great. I think it's really interesting. I'd be interested to know how you would stratify the sample. Can I sneak in a second question, or am I done?
Yeah, go for it. Okay,
so Peter, earlier on you said one of the questions you posed was, can there be metaphysical neutrality in psychedelic practice? And a question I have for both of you, slightly tweaked, is should there be metaphysical neutrality in psychedelic research?
Well, I suppose that question depends on the first question, can there be, right? And if there can be, then should there be, a second question. I personally don't think there can be neutrality because, I mean, maybe to an extent, but, we have to sort of realize that we are living in an ideology ourselves that you can trace historically and whatever, this is not a value neutral, objective framework in which we conduct our science. We have, and this is part of the history of philosophy and the history of really the West, we have a specific trajectory in which certain metaphysics has taken over, especially with a special emphasis on 17th century turn from Aristotelianism to mechanism. So, you can be neutral as regards the West, perhaps, but that's not neutral. That's not objectively neutral. But let's say you could be neutral. Should you be?
Yes.
Then that's on the assumption that you could be. I would say, well, should, of course, then requires an ethical standard, which we sort of also have in the West, right? So it gets really complicated. One way you could look at it, I suppose, is from a utilitarian point of view, where you'd say, well, should we try to influence people if we know that one particular metaphysical outcome has greater mental health benefits than others? But of course, if you were to do that, you might sort of, make, it's completely conjecturing now, that you might make people better, but then you face the so-called comforting delusion objection, right? That, this is not, it's unethical to actually make people better through this means.
I mean, no, the church does this all the time. I mean, this is more complex. I think so on the one hand, yes, I don't think, I agree with you that there is nobody who doesn't have any beliefs, but the idea is that these beliefs have to be coherent across their lives, the different situations they're in, especially over the long term. Seems to me there's no good reason to assume that they are. If they don't have a strong metaphysical system they believe in, such as being very active in a particular religion, or what we might more widely call a belief system to which they actually positively see themselves committed. And even then, you find these discrepancies between, say, people who are Catholic and some of the research they might do in a laboratory that might not be in accordance with what actually chimes with these churches' explicit credo. So I think consistency is one of the big tricks. And the other thing is to influence people in what they believe, whether that is before, so in the initial setting. Yeah? And people who have strong beliefs do believe, I think, that having their beliefs is better for them than it is for those poor agnostics or unbelievers to be poor agnostics or unbelievers. This is common across all religions. Yeah? So this brings you in very complex binds. One thing is that you might be, as a methodology, doing this kind of research, you need, I think it would be good to at least make sure that you have on the board and in putting this together and assessing it, people who actually have themselves different beliefs and that you can actually talk about them. So it'd be really transparency, critical reflection, and a mix of different positions within a team or an assessment panel or something would seem, I think, critical to avoid the worst biases that you could get in, like the Hood thing, which was so biased in the initial data collection that you can just think, well, why was this ever taken seriously?
Well, I think Peter covered a lot of my own thoughts on it, but I'd also just like answer your question by asking another question back to you and sort of say, well, why is this area any different to any other area of academia? You could argue because metaphysical, well, what we just argued is metaphysical beliefs seem to be more affected than, let's say, if you get someone to do a memory test. But why should metaphysical assumptions be considered when performing any other type of psychology or sociology or this, that, the other? And I think we sort of just naturally, but we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. If you don't, then you're just reinforcing the status quo oftentimes. And if you do, you're into the territory of, well, who's the arbiter and why do I know any better? So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. I actually don't think there is. So if we look at the drug trials, for instance, and so the talk that David Nutt gave the week prior, people who do these kind of research, it would be a fool's game for us to think that they're neutral in that kind of research. But I was just really interested to know what your response was. And I like what Christine said about potentially being very transparent about your belief system with this kind of thing, because I think more transparency in this regard, I think could, I don't know, it could kind of open up some of the muddier waters that you see with this kind of research. But that's just me thinking aloud. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, I mean, you know, this is in its very nature immensely complex when you get into the history and sociology and anthropology that all factor into these analyses. Did you have a question?
Yeah. So, okay. So very, very interesting. I have one practical question: whether you're going to account for different psychedelics and how they affect, you know, metaphysical beliefs or all psychedelic experiences in general. So whether this shows in the questionnaire in some way. And secondly, so not a very practical question, but so a lot of sort of abstraction in what you're trying to do, from going from experience to theory and standardization. And, you know, Rennie already said, so it's quite hard using this matrix to actually come up with questions and how to organize all of that. So aren't you worried that some of it might just, you know, not be there, or the actual experience, individual experience might kind of disappear in all of this, all the standardization and abstraction that the surveys will do?
I'll start with the last one. You can go to the detail first one. Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, this is not supposed to be an ideal. It's just supposed to be an improvement of what we have at the moment, you know, and even that maybe it's not. It's yeah, you can't. I mean, you know, the word mysticism comes from mystes, which means closed eyes, right? By its very definition, it's not open to analysis. It's ineffable, another classic criterion of the psychedelic experience from William James, right? So, I mean, yeah, we have to accept the fact that this will not be comprehensive or exhaustive, but at the same time, one can see certain patterns perhaps. So you just try to kind of perhaps differentiate those patterns a bit more than has been done before. But like I say, I think this can be, you know, just a rung on the ladder that could potentially be improved. Well, could be certainly improved as the years go by. But at the same time, I don't think we'll ever reach a stage where you can perfectly model an experience, because experience is one thing, of course, and words are another thing, right? Which are just representations or attempted representations.
I mean, it depends what your goal is with the survey. I mean, if you want to see if there's any therapeutic application, then, you know, it's clearer as to what you're trying to do. So maybe contextualizing the survey might help as well.
So I think at first, this study sort of just, we don't have a measure for getting at people's beliefs. We don't really have good tools for it. So I think this is like the first thing that we need to do. And we're never going to have a good measure. But to come to what you said, it's like...
Sorry, so when you say people, you mean people in the West?
No, anyone, anywhere. But I suppose this would be biased towards the West.
Yeah.
So you mentioned different psychedelics, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so I guess, like, to go back to like the bigger picture thinking, I think what would be really neat is, so this related project looking at the trip reports, which is people talking about their experience on different, I guess, the subjective experience of taking different substances, right? And we wouldn't assume that all psychedelics have the same therapeutic potential for the same people. We'd say within a psychedelic, the therapeutic potential is different for every person, and between psychedelics, the therapeutic potential is different for different people. And so I think what would be really neat is if we can access the parts of the subjective experiences that are brought on. Of course, the subjective experience for a drug is different for different people, so you can't say it's the same every time. But let's say there were general patterns in giving someone the subjective experience of giving someone psilocybin versus ketamine. Now, there might be something about the subjective experience of psilocybin that's really therapeutic for some aspects of trauma, whereas ketamine might be really beneficial for other aspects of trauma. And I think that's just a matter of time. And there's so much more research that needs to be done. I think this type of analysis could be part of doing that. So we have our businessman turning into a hippie type thing.
But this is all just exploratory, you know,
Yeah.
first steps.
I mean, it's all very, very interesting, and I think it's, you know, it's really important to do this work. But I think we also have to be a bit careful. I don't know, you know, I mean, what even is a metaphysical belief? You know.
What is it?
I don't know.
What is the belief? Yeah. Well, you get into philosophy there immediately. Adrian.
I don't know whether anybody heard it yesterday, but there was on Radio 4, there was an Inside Science that talked about this extraordinary experience where somebody had looked out of a window and seen a crow snowboarding down a roof, and then picking up this bit of wood and taking it back to the top of the roof, and then jumping on again, doing it. And
What were they taking?
Sorry, yeah, well, that's a very good question. But the point was, what the professor who had been looking at this was saying was that if you set up a group of scientists to try and find a snowboarding crow, it would cost you £5 million, and the chance of them ever being there when the snowboarding crow was there was zero. So innovative sort of leisure behaviour amongst a corvid that can pass the theory of mind test and all those sorts of things is very interesting. But what she said was that science needs to get much more into tapping the vast pool of everybody pouring out all their stuff onto YouTube and everything else, and that the zoologists and animal psychologists were looking more and more at this. So what struck me was when you were talking about the Lewick study, I've just come off the end of a 4-year project with Innovate UK looking at problem gamblers using techniques to do that. And what we found was that if you get a qualitative study with a small number of problem gamblers, you get a very close set of techniques. But when you say, like, show us every problem gambling forum in the world and then do a linguistic analysis, what you get out of that is hugely richer and better at training the machine learning models. So, you know, we found that when instances of the word trigger came up in people's self-reported public gambling, that the word loneliness was 30 times more likely to appear in the same context. So what we were doing was tying the incidence of certain keywords with the incidence and frequency of other keywords wrapped around that cluster in a database of 6 million words rather than just one piece of quantitative research. So as far as I'm concerned, it looks like the Newick side of the door, and looking at those things would be hugely beneficial in training your scale, because you get rid of a lot of the noise just by the scale.
Yeah, so I think both of those approaches are really useful for their in their own rights, right? So like, for example, the example you gave in gambling, if when the word trigger comes up, the word loneliness comes up, well, then you might start developing a theory that gambling is at least partially, problem gambling is at least partially mediated by the feeling of loneliness. So then you might generate an intervention that tries to stop people from being as lonely so they don't gamble as much. So I think that's one of the neat things about this exploratory approach. But then I also think, well, it might be that the word trigger, it could be they're feeling lonely and they're holding a gun and with the finger on the trigger, or it could be it's a trigger for my gambling. So I think like words have many, and I think here's where like actually doing as good as the machine learning and the big data approach is, it can never replace a person sitting and trying to pick apart another person's subjective, more intricate aspects of the subjective.
I mean, interesting, what we also found was that things like use of active and passive constructions and uses of pronouns rather, using it instead of describing what it is, also had a lot of correlations with types of behavior. So what you're saying about sort of word frequency and analysis of sentence parts is also, I think, really relevant to it, because you can segment the experience, but you can segment the people who are offering their views of the experience as well, which helps. So sharing it.
Right.
Yeah, I have two things, and they're not really clear-cut questions, but just something that came to mind. So first, looking at the text that you were offering to the participants as like what you were asking them to write about, and for me, like the initial reaction to that was that like, well, that doesn't really even address metaphysical beliefs that much. Like it sounds much more sort of therapeutic or something like this, and that the like I guess metaphysical beliefs in the sense, for me at least, they relate to these like things like about nature, reality, and God, and all these kinds of things, and not so much about the sort of present day experience of a person. So I was wondering, like, how could you address that sort of like what's therapeutic and what's actually like a shift in perspective? So that was like a shift in perspective in terms of like the personal experience of life. And then
can I just answer that first?
Yeah, sure.
So I guess, it was really difficult, like, because we didn't want to just ask them again about their metaphysical beliefs, but this time get them to write about it. We sort of want, like, the idea of this is that what is it about the shifts in metaphysical beliefs that people undergo when they're on psychedelics? Does it change their everyday experience? So like after you've done psychedelics and you realize the connectedness of everything, and then you look at a tree, is that subjective experience of looking at that tree with that interconnectedness fresh in your mind, very different of just walking past and, oh, it's a tree, I use it to make fire or whatever, I don't know, that's more what I was going for there, but not sure if that's like
I think it relates to what I was thinking like afterwards. It's just like obviously what you're trying to do is amazing and extremely complex, so there's so many things to consider. So, but that, also I guess for like we still think of like mystical experiences also in this little bit like Americanized manner, that people sort of have this certain kind of divine experience or something, and then they do have this like radical shift of perspective. But I think there's probably also a lot of people who kind of go into just like state of confusion or agnosticism, or just like being in a very or nihilism, or like I don't know. I wonder if you how do you address these kinds of things, or like does it fit somewhere in your consideration?
I just had a brainwave. Linking to what Christine was saying earlier as well, it's like, do you think it'd be useful if, like, let's say we have the questionnaire, we have the open text response, whether it's like indirect or implicit, right? And then maybe just then ask them to write about their beliefs and their views in free form, and have both of those things. That might, help address.
Yeah, probably it would cover people.
Yeah, I don't know.
Think about it. I mean, another point is, yeah, there is a question on nihilism as it happens, and there's also always the don't know response you can say to all of these.
Yeah,
well,
sure.
like a middle point.
Yeah,
And there's even, like I said, like the no belief kind of,
Is the initial format for that because I think also for a lot of people, they don't necessarily, well, obviously they don't know this kind of terminology, but I think for a lot of people also who undergo psychedelic experiences, like maybe they just don't get to that stage where they're really even thinking about metaphysical questions. Maybe they're really just like, wow, this walk in the park feels so much nicer.
I mean, first thing I should say is this is about metaphysics rather than psychedelics, really. That it can be later applied to psychedelic experience, but the real thing is metaphysics. What was really difficult, I mean, one thing which is difficult is to try to just map out different metaphysical positions that intersect, obviously. But the next problem is like being able to state it in questions that are intelligible to the man on the street. That was, and we haven't got that perfect yet.
Yeah.
And if we had more time and money, I think we could spend more time on this. But like I say, it's that's the first.
Amazing stuff. Anyways, thank you so much.
That kind of speaks to the question I was sort of playing with anyway, which is like, how many questions are there that map onto the specific different ideologies, I suppose, and how fearful are you that a lack of articulation to make it sensible to the common person, but also even, I wish I could come up with an example on the spot, but there are certain ways you could articulate idealism that the same person would go, oh, or actually there's something to that. How fearful are you that a precise articulation would have to be necessary to even capture everybody properly, or that risks damaging the questioner?
That's why we're sort of just letting the data speak for itself. Like, what is going to be most statistically meaningful, rather than, I don't think we're going to capture all of the nuanced metaphysical positions out there in the population.
No, but I really think, and that's what Jamie and I agreed on, is sort of you need to do a few pilots with a few very different people and see how they actually respond to your questions, and actually discuss with them later how they understood your questions, so that you actually get some information, not just from sort of us here, in terms of how your questions are being picked up by people from different communities. So I think proper pilot would be really good to sort of refine these questions. Otherwise, you might be just talking past people.
I mean, we have discussed this. One issue, of course, is time and money. So
yeah.
Can I just add? I mean, on this issue of how to articulate the questions, I also think. I mean, people will answer questions whether they can articulate metaphysical theories or not. People have beliefs about their lives. So I think maybe it might be easier if the survey questions are about life and how they see it and how they feel, like you've done in the, the open text question, rather than about metaphysical theories, because it's easier for people, I think, to tap into how they feel about life, about their experiences. This is easy to talk about or to explain. But if you ask them to say whether this is panpsychism or some other attribution, that might make it difficult. So
I mean, two things I'd say before Rennie can say. I think if we were to do that, then it would be another job to translate those answers back into the metaphysical. That would be much harder, I think. Secondly, the questions are not. They don't use philosophical terms, so it doesn't say, "Do you believe in panpsychism?" It tries to word them in a way in which, as good as possible, not perfect.
I'm actually saying I think that would be the better way to
do
it.
That's what we are attempting to do.
But then we'd have to infer people's beliefs.
Yes.
I mean, it's paradoxical.
Yeah.
You may also want to think about whether, to what extent people, and this is born in the background as well, to what extent people actually care about the metaphysical stuff. Because, for example, I'm interested in metaphysical stuff only instrumentally because it's relevant to my thinking about teleological stuff about morality. But apart from that, I really don't care about the God and metaphysics stuff about stuff that lies behind that. And if you gave me that open-ended question today, I wouldn't absolutely know what to write, how to answer that question. I just go, I don't know, hand it back to you.
You can't, you have to write a minimum.
Yeah.
And if it's nonsense, or
You can't do that. You never get the data, basically, if I was trying to
yeah,
do something.
you'd write some nonsense or.
I just write something,
Mm.
not caring whether it's going to be answered.
But then that is a thing.
Yeah. That's
So
my
That
point.
might be a type of person that does that.
That's my point. I want to gauge that as well.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, there's another chat. I think.
The assumption is that
Thank
people
you.
care about this stuff and like answer with the assumption that they actually
I'll,
care.
I'll read this out from Anke. Could you ask participants to write about self-defining memory, autobiographical event important to them, question mark, before and after the psychedelic experience to tap into possible changes?
Sorry, I didn't register any of that. About self-defining memory. Yeah, I guess you could. I get that. The thing is, it's so broad, and it's almost like what isn't included in this. So it's like, I think it's you can only do so much at one point in time, and it's already, even just with these two things, it's already so complex, and it's going to be really hard to interpret. I'm skeptical as to it, if it will even work in a statistical sense. So I think adding more stuff is at this point, I think, yeah, although I can see why that might be interesting.
Okay, let's head to the pub. Everyone online? Leave this to you or?
You just,
Still ongoing, actually.